Harlan Bishop had learned, sometime in the long stretch of years after losing his wife, that dignity was not something the world offered freely. It had to be chosen, sometimes daily, sometimes hour by hour, in the spaces where no one was watching and nothing made it easy. He ran a small woodworking shop on the edge of Riverton, a quiet town 2 hours north of Toronto, where the main street still had a hardware store and a family-owned diner, and people still said good morning to strangers. The shop was called Bishop Woodworks. The sign had been painted by his late wife, Evelyn, in the summer before she was diagnosed. She'd used a deep barn red because she said it looked honest. He'd never changed it. Evelyn had died of ovarian cancer 3 years earlier, leaving behind Harlan and their 8-year-old daughter, Clem. Now, Clem was 9 and Harlan was 38, and some mornings when the alarm went off, before dawn he lay there for a few seconds, wondering how he was supposed to keep doing this. Then he heard her moving around in her room, padding down the hall in her sock feet, filling the kettle for hot chocolate, and he remembered exactly why. The shop was modest, a front room where Harlan displayed finished pieces and a back workshop where the real work happened. He'd inherited his father's tools and bought the rest secondhand. The lease was more than he liked, but the location was good, and he'd built enough of a reputation in Riverton that word of mouth kept him busy. Not prosperous. Busy. On a Thursday in late October, a black Range Rover pulled into the gravel lot beside the shop. The woman who stepped out wore a cream-colored coat that belonged in a different postal code. She stood in front of the shop's weathered sign for a moment, looking at it the way people sometimes look at things they've already decided are beneath them. Her name was Cordelia Drake. She was the chief executive of Drake Properties, one of the largest real estate development firms in Ontario, and she had come to Riverton because her company was acquiring a parcel of land 40 minutes north, and she'd decided to combine the trip with a personal errand. She explained when she stepped through the shop door, an antique sideboard cabinet, 18th century walnut original hardware, that needed restoration before a gala dinner at her Forest Hill home the following weekend. 3 shops in Toronto had told her the timeline was impossible. Someone at her club had mentioned Bishop Woodworks. Harlan listened. He looked at the photographs she showed him on her phone, assessed the work required, and quoted her $280 for labor. The piece was in reasonable condition. What it needed was cleaning, some minor joinery repair on one of the hinges, and a careful wax finish to bring back the grain. She asked if he could have it finished by Wednesday. He said yes. What he didn't tell her was that finishing by Wednesday meant working late Tuesday night after putting Clem to bed. He didn't mention that because it wasn't her business and because he'd made harder promises to harder deadlines. The cabinet came in on Friday. Harlan worked on it Saturday afternoon while Clem sat at the small desk in the corner of the front room doing her homework, the same way she did most weekends. He liked having her there. She liked the smell of the shop, sawdust and linseed oil and something older underneath, something that reminded her, she once said, of her grandfather's house. By Tuesday night, the cabinet was finished. Harlan stood back and looked at it under the shop lights. The walnut had come alive again, deep and warm, the grain running like water across the front panels. The hinge sat flush, every joint was clean. He felt the small, quiet satisfaction he always felt when a piece of wood became fully itself again. Wednesday morning, Cordelia arrived at 10 o'clock. She walked around the cabinet twice without speaking. Then she looked at Harlan. "It's not quite what I expected," she said. Harlan waited. "The finish looks uneven near the top corner." He looked at the corner she was indicating. The finish was not uneven. He knew it wasn't uneven because he'd gone over that session 3 times with the finest grade of cloth he owned. The grain in that area ran slightly against the main direction, which gave it a different light catch depending on where you stood. It was not a flaw, it was the wood. He explained this quietly and without any edge in his voice. Cordelia looked at him for a moment. "I don't think so." She reached into her bag and produced nothing. She set nothing on the counter. She simply picked up her car keys from where she'd placed them and said, "I'll have someone come by Thursday to pick it up." "The invoice is $280, Harlan said. She glanced at the paper he'd set beside the cabinet. The number seemed to cause her a brief, private amusement, the way a person looks at a price tag that's far lower than expected and somehow finds it insulting anyway. "I don't feel the work justifies it," she said. "The finish isn't right." Harlan held her gaze. "The finish is right." She picked up her bag. "Have it ready Thursday," and she walked out. The shop went quiet. Outside, the Range Rover pulled out of the gravel lot. Harlan stood looking at the cabinet for a long moment, then at the invoice on the counter with nothing beneath it. Clem had stopped working on her homework. "Dad," she said carefully. I know. She didn't pay. No. Clem looked toward the door. Are you going to call her? Harlan thought about it honestly. He could call. He could send a formal notice. He could refuse to release the cabinet until the invoice was settled. All of those things were within his rights, yes, and none of them felt like what he wanted to do right now. I'm going to think about it, he said. He picked up a cloth and started wiping down the workbench. Not because it needed wiping, but because keeping his hands busy was the only reliable way he'd ever found to keep his thoughts from becoming something he'd regret. Clem watched him. She was rude to you. She was. That's not fair. No, Harlan agreed. It isn't. She was quiet for a moment, and then Mom would have said something. Harlan stopped wiping. A small involuntary sound escaped him, something between a laugh and a sigh. Your mom would have said a lot of things. He looked at his daughter. But she also used to tell me that the moments when you want to react the most are exactly the moments when you need to think the hardest. Clem absorbed that with the patience she applied to most things. Evelyn used to say Clem had been born with an old soul and a new heart. Watching her now, Harlan thought that was still exactly right. So thinking is what you're doing right now? Clem asked. Trying to. What neither of them noticed was the man seated in the small waiting area near the front window. He'd come in 20 minutes earlier, asking whether Harlan did refinishing work on older furniture, had said he'd come back with photographs, and had settled into one of the wooden chairs near the window while he scrolled through his phone. He was elderly, mid-70s at least, with white hair and a face that had been handsome for a long time and was now simply distinguished. He wore a plain gray jacket that was well made but gave nothing away. His name was Cecil Fairbanks. He was Cordelia Drake's father. He had arrived in Riverton the previous evening for reasons that had nothing to do with his daughter's errand. A property donation he was making quietly to a conservation land trust in the area. The kind of thing he preferred to handle in person and without announcements. He'd noticed the Bishop Woodwork sign while walking past that morning. He'd come in on an impulse, the way he sometimes did when something caught his attention. He had not planned to witness what he'd just witnessed. He sat very still now, his phone face down on his knee, watching Harlan move around the workshop. What he saw was not composure exactly. Cecil had learned to read people over 7 decades, and he recognized this as something harder and more honest than composure. It was restraint, the conscious, effortful kind, the kind that cost something. He thought of his daughter. He thought of how easily she had done what she'd done. Not with cruelty exactly, but with a total absence of consideration. The way people behave when they have gone so long without consequences that other people have simply stopped feeling real to them. And then he thought about something that had happened 43 years ago, in a city he hadn't lived in for decades. Cecil Fairbanks had not always had money. He had started with a single room above a laundromat in Hamilton, a half-finished business degree, and a used truck with a transmission that gave out in January of 1981. He'd been 22 years old and $300 short of his rent, and he'd pushed the truck 2 blocks to the nearest garage and explained his situation to the mechanic behind the counter. The mechanic's name had been Arthur. He'd never known the last name and had always regretted that. Arthur had fixed the transmission and waved off the invoice and told Cecil to come back and pay when he could. Cecil had paid eventually with interest. By then, Arthur's shop had closed. He'd never been able to find the man again. He'd spent more than 4 decades thinking about Arthur and the kind of person it took to make that kind of choice. Sitting now in a small woodworking shop in Riverton, watching a single father quietly wipe down a workbench, while his daughter sat in the corner, Cecil Fairbanks thought, I know who this man is. He stood, nodded briefly to Harlan, and said he'd be back with those photographs, then he left. But he didn't go back to where he was staying. He walked the main street of Riverton for the better part of an hour, talking to people. He had a way of doing this, unremarkable, unhurried, genuinely curious, that put people at ease. He had coffee at the diner on the corner and listened to what the woman behind the counter said about the town. He stopped at the hardware store. He talked to the owner of the bookshop 2 doors down. By early afternoon, he had a picture far larger than the one he'd seen in the shop. He heard about the elementary school library renovation the previous spring, for which Harlan had built custom bookshelves at cost and refused the school board's offer of full payment. He heard about the retired couple on Maple Street whose porch railing Harlan had replaced after a winter storm. No invoice, no explanation, just a new railing one morning. He heard about the family that had moved to Riverton from out west with almost nothing, and how Harlan had built them a kitchen table over a weekend and brought it to their door. He heard about how Harlan coached Clem's hockey team on Tuesday evenings even though he wasn't a particularly strong skater, and freely admitted it. That last detail made Cecil smile. That evening he called his assistant. "I need everything you can find on a man named Harlan Bishop," he said. "Riverton, Ontario. He runs a woodworking shop." There was a pause. "A woodworker?" "Just find it." The next afternoon, Clem came into the shop after school to find her father repairing the leg of an antique rocking chair for Mrs. Dumont, an 80-year-old woman who lived 3 blocks away and had been bringing her furniture to Harlan since the year he'd opened. Clem dropped her backpack, helped herself to the apple on Harlan's desk, and climbed onto her stool. "Mrs. Arsenault said our class trip is in December," she said. Harlan kept working. "To where?" "The Science Museum in Toronto. It's $65. He set down his tool and looked at her. She was looking back at him with the careful expression she wore when she was trying to decide whether to worry. He recognized it because it was exactly the same expression Evelyn had worn. The same slight tension at the corners of the eyes. "We'll sort it out," he said. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." She studied him for a moment longer, then relaxed and took a bite of the apple. "Okay." It was that simple with her. She needed honesty, and she needed to know he'd thought about it. Once she had both of those things, she let it go. He was glad she couldn't see the arithmetic he was running quietly in his head. The November rent was due in 10 days. The lease on the sander was up for renewal. The unpaid invoice from Cordelia Drake sat in his desk drawer, $280 that would have made the week considerably more manageable. He had not called her. He had written out a follow-up invoice and sealed it in an envelope ready to mail. Whether she responded was up to her. He had done the work. He had done it honestly. The record of that existed whether or not she chose to acknowledge it. That was what he told himself when the arithmetic got heavy. On the second day, Cecil Fairbanks returned to Bishop Woodworks. He came alone this time, without photographs. He looked around the front room at the pieces on display, the table, the chairs, the small cabinet with hand-cut dovetails in the corner, and then he sat down in the same chair by the window. Harlan came out from the back. He recognized him from 2 days earlier. "You came back," Harlan said. "I did." Cecil looked at him steadily. "I didn't actually come for furniture advice." Harlan waited. "I was here 2 days ago when the woman came in, the one with the sideboard cabinet." Something shifted in Harlan's expression. Not alarm, but attention. "You saw that?" "All of it." Harlan set down the sanding block he was holding. He didn't say anything. "I want you to know," Cecil said, "that her behavior was unacceptable, and I want you to know that I understand exactly what she cost you." "She cost me $280. Cecil shook his head slowly. "That's not all she cost you." The room was quiet. Clem was not in the shop today. She had hockey practice. Through the back window, Harlan could see the oak tree at the edge of the property, its last leaves hanging motionless in the gray October air. "I've spent the past 2 days talking to people in this town," Cecil said. "I want to be honest with you about that." Harlan looked at him with something that might have been wariness. "Everywhere I went," Cecil continued, "I heard the same things, that you're fair, that you're reliable, that you help people even when it costs you something, that you've never done any of it for recognition." He paused. "I'm not telling you this to embarrass you. I'm telling you because it matters. Because I've been looking for someone for a long time, and I had nearly stopped believing I'd find them." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed an envelope on the counter between them. "My name is Cecil Fairbanks," he said. "I founded Fairbanks Development in 1989. My daughter took over the company 12 years ago. You may know it now as Drake Properties." He held Harlan's gaze. "Cordelia Drake is my daughter." The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Harlan looked at the envelope. He did not touch it. "I'm not here because of what happened with the cabinet," Cecil said. "Or rather, that's what brought me here, but it's not why I'm staying." He gestured toward the envelope. "Open it when you're ready. But let me explain first." He explained. 7 years ago, after stepping back from the day-to-day operations of Fairbanks Development, Cecil had begun quietly building something different. Not another corporation. A foundation, the kind he wished had existed when he was 22 years old, pushing a broken truck through January in Hamilton. Something focused on skilled trades training in smaller communities. Apprenticeships, tools, real and tangible work for young people who weren't interested in university and weren't finding many open doors. He had the structure. He had the funding. He had a board who believed in the mission. What he had not had, and what he had been searching for with increasing frustration, was the right person to lead it. Not a manager. Not an administrator. Someone whose understanding of the work came from having actually done it. Someone who knew what it meant to build something with their hands and take pride in it. Someone who had learned to value quality and honesty, not because they'd been rewarded for it, but because they couldn't imagine doing it any other way. "I've interviewed people with excellent credentials," Cecil said quietly. "Not one of them passed the tests I couldn't put on paper." Harlan's hands were very still. "You did," Cecil said, "not because you restored a cabinet, because of what you did after." Harlan picked up the envelope. Inside was a single document, and behind it, a certified check. He unfolded the check first, the way a person does when they're expecting one number and suspect they might find another. The number was 18,000. He read it 3 times. He set it down on the counter with the exaggerated care of someone not entirely sure they're seeing correctly. "That's not," started again, "that's not something a person gives to someone they've known for 2 days. "No," Cecil agreed. "It's something I give to someone I've been watching for 43 years without knowing his name." He told him about Arthur then, the Hamilton garage, the broken truck, the waived invoice, the debt he'd spent decades unable to repay properly. "I've been looking for the chance to pay it forward in a way that actually means something. Not charity, an investment, in someone who will use it the way it needs to be used." Harlan sat down heavily in the chair across from Cecil. He looked at the check. He looked at the document outlining the foundation's mandate, its scope, its existing assets. "I'm a carpenter," he said. "Yes. I don't have a business degree. I don't have nonprofit management experience." "You have something more important," Cecil said. "You have character. The management can be learned. The character can't." Harlan was quiet for a long time. The afternoon light came low through the front windows, catching the grain of the display table in a way that made the wood glow amber and deep. He thought about Clem on her stool in the corner. He thought about the $65 school trip. He thought about the unpaid invoice in the desk drawer and the rent due in 10 days. And then, somehow, he thought past all of that, to something Evelyn had said to him once, early in their relationship, before he'd really understood her yet. She'd said, "Some people receive good things and stop there. Other people receive good things and figure out how to multiply them for everyone around them. I want to be the second kind." He'd thought she was talking about herself. He'd only understood much later that she'd been talking about what she saw in him. "I need to think," he said. Cecil nodded. "Take the time you need." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing, the $280 your daughter owes you. I'll make sure she knows I witnessed all of it. What she does with that information is up to her. I won't force it, but she should know." He told Clem that evening over dinner. He told her all of it. Cordelia, the check, Cecil, the foundation. He laid it out honestly because she was old enough to understand and because he had always believed she deserved the truth. She sat across from him with her fork set down and her full attention on his face. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to say yes?" she asked. "I'm thinking about it." She tilted her head. "Why aren't you sure?" He considered how to answer that. "Because it's very large, and I'm not sure I'm the right person." Clem thought about this with the same patience she applied to most things. "Dad, you built Mrs. Dumont's rocking chair supports because she cried when she saw the broken joint. You fixed the LaRue family's floor for free because their kid was sick. You stayed up until midnight making a hockey trophy for Tyler Arsenal because the one the league ordered got lost in shipping." She looked at him steadily. "You already run the foundation. You just don't have the money yet." He didn't say anything. "Mom would have told you to say yes," Clem said simply. Then she picked up her fork again and resumed eating, as though the matter were settled. He smiled despite himself. He thought, yes, she absolutely would have. 12 days later, Cordelia Drake drove back to Riverton alone. There was no assistant in the passenger seat, no property tour scheduled, no business reason attached to the visit. She came because her father had called her 3 days after his visit to Bishop Woodworks and told her in precise and measured terms what he had seen. He had not shouted. He had never shouted, even when she was a teenager, and probably deserved it. He had simply told her the truth the way he always did, quietly, without editorializing, and with the full expectation that she would know what to do with it. She'd spent 3 days figuring out what to do with it. She walked into Bishop Woodworks on a Tuesday morning carrying a small envelope. Harlan was at the workbench. He looked up when the door opened, recognized her, and stayed completely still. She placed the envelope on the counter without speaking first. Inside was a check for $280, a handwritten receipt acknowledging the work had been completed to standard, and a letter. The letter was not long. She had written it 6 times before arriving at one she could stand behind. In it, she said she had been arrogant. She said she had treated him as though the quality of his work was less important than the opinion she'd formed of him before she'd stepped through his door. She said she understood that $280 was not a trivial amount, and that her refusal to pay it had been an act of contempt she wasn't proud of. She said she was sorry, not only because her father had called her, though he had, but because she'd had 3 days to sit honestly with what she'd done, and she knew it was wrong. Harlan read the letter fully and carefully, the way he did most things. Then he looked at her. "Thank you," he said. She had been braced for more, for coldness or reproach, or the quiet satisfaction people sometimes take in watching others be uncomfortable. None of it came. "Everyone makes mistakes," Harlan said. "The question is what we do after." It was so simply and earnestly meant that she found herself unexpectedly moved by it. Something in that room, the smell of sawdust, the light through the old windows, the photograph of a woman and a little girl on the shelf behind the counter, made her eyes sting in a way she hadn't expected and couldn't entirely control. She didn't stay long, there wasn't much else to say, and she knew it. But as she drove back toward Toronto, she thought about her father's foundation, and Harlan Bishop leading it, and the considerable distance between the person she'd assumed she was and the person her behavior had actually described. She thought about it for a long time, longer perhaps than she had thought about anything in years. The Fairbanks Community Trades Foundation officially opened its doors the following March. The ceremony was held at the community center in Riverton, and it was not a lavish event. There were folding chairs and coffee urns, and a banner that Clem had helped design on graph paper one evening in the shop. Cecil Fairbanks sat in the front row. Most of the town came. Mrs. Dumont came, and the LaRue family, and the school principal, and a dozen young people who were already enrolled in the foundation's first apprenticeship cohort. Harlan spoke briefly. He was not a polished speaker and made no attempt to be. He talked about his father's tools and about what it had meant to learn something real with his hands, and about the kind of opportunities he wished had existed when he'd been 20 and unsure, and looking for a way forward that didn't require he be someone other than himself. He talked about Evelyn quietly, about what she'd believed about multiplying good things. He did not mention $280, or an October morning, or a woman who had tried to make him feel small. He didn't need to. Clem stood beside him for the last part of his remarks. She was wearing her good plaid shirt. She held a small wooden plaque she'd made in the shop, a gift for Cecil with the foundation's name carefully routed into a piece of white oak. She handed it to him when Harlan finished, and Cecil held it in both hands for a long moment looking at the wood. "You made this yourself?" he asked her. "Dad helped with the router," she said, "but the lettering was mine." Cecil smiled. "It's beautiful work." "It took me 4 tries," she said honestly. Cecil laughed, a full, genuine sound that startled the people nearest to him. He looked across at Harlan. 4 tries, he repeated. "She's going to be extraordinary." Harlan looked at his daughter standing there with her chin up and her hands clasped behind her back. "I know," he said. Outside, the March light was thin and clean on the snow. The town of Riverton looked exactly as it always had, unhurried particular. A place where things grew slowly and lasted a long time. The story of what had happened had made its way through every kitchen table and diner counter in town within a week. The cabinet, the check, the woman who had come back alone to say sorry. People talked about it the way they talked about things that confirmed what they'd always believed. That honesty had weight, that dignity traveled further than arrogance, that a person's quietest choices were often the ones that mattered most. Clem had thought about it a great deal since October. She'd thought about the morning Cordelia Drake drove away without paying, and the way her father had simply stood at the workbench afterward and not become someone different. She'd thought she was watching him absorb a loss. She understood now that she'd been watching something else entirely, a choice he had been making every single day of his life, quietly in the spaces where no one was watching and there was nothing to gain. She was 9 years old. She understood already that the $18 million was not the extraordinary thing. The extraordinary thing was the man who had earned it by never once trying to.